Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this, I don't know, this expectation of absolute precision.
Oh, sure, like it's engineering or something.
Right, like you fall, you break your arm, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the glowing screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, yep, there it is.
Yeah, the bone is broken or it isn't broken. It's a completely binary system.
It's clean. And honestly, it's kind of comforting. We like things to be visible and categorized, but then you step into the world of child welfare and state interventions, and suddenly that x-ray machine is just completely broken.
Oh, completely.
We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, you are looking at a system that relies so heavily on subjective human interpretation,
Right.
where the line between, protecting a vulnerable child and completely overstepping boundaries is often just a matter of perspective.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today. We are taking a really massive stack of data to figure out how the Minnesota child welfare system actually operates.
Yeah, we've got quite the mix of sources for this deep dive.
We really do. We're looking at rigid legislative audits, state budgets, official agency guidelines from the Department of Children, Youth, and Families.
Right, the official state stuff.
Exactly. But we also pulled a Minnesota family law blog, a Reddit forum where social workers and foster parents anonymously talk shop, which is fascinating.
Very eye-opening, yeah.
And a raw, really highly emotional YouTube video from a mother named Christina who went through this firsthand. So our mission for this deep dive is to see what happens when the mechanisms of the state collide with the messy reality of a family.
And to really grasp the gravity of this, you have to understand the sheer scale of the bureaucracy we are talking about.
Right, it's huge.
Historically, the Minnesota Department of Human Services has been the state's largest agency. We are talking about a $45 billion budget.
Billion! With a B. That is wild.
It is so vast, in fact, that a 2023 state law was passed to actually physically split it up.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the system had become just too sprawling to manage effectively under one roof. So they moved child protection, adoption, and family services into a brand new standalone agency.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's called the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, or DCYF.
The best way to visualize a system of that size is like a giant, well-intentioned safety net. It was designed, woven together to catch the absolute most vulnerable people in our society when they fall.
Which is a good thing.
Right. But over time, it has become so heavy and so incredibly complex that it sometimes tangles up the very people it was built to protect.
That's a really good way to put it.
And, if you're listening, you might be thinking, well, I don't have kids. This system doesn't touch my life at all. But this is fundamentally about what happens when massive state power intersects with deeply personal, subjective human lives.
Right, because we all interact with bureaucracies.
Exactly. We all have neighbors. We all have moments of vulnerability.
And that intersection is where the theory of protection meets the reality of enforcement.
Yeah.
And as we look at Christina's YouTube narrative today, we really need to look at her story through an objective lens.
For sure. I mean, we obviously haven't seen the sealed court documents of her specific case.
Right. And our goal isn't to validate every specific claim she makes or to, take any sort of political stance here.
No, not at all. Rather, her story serves as a perfect lens to view the broader mechanics of a machine that she found herself caught in.
Exactly.
So how does a family actually get tangled in this net in the first place? Because according to the DCYF data, it starts with a report, and they field about 18,000 of those reports every single year across the state.
And what stands out in the data from the Office of the Legislative Auditor, the OLA, is how decentralized the response to those 18,000 reports actually is.
Right, because it's not just one big state office making the call.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Minnesota provides child protection services at the county level. So that means local county officials and even individual city police departments have substantial discretion in how they interpret a crisis.
And the OLA presentation highlighted some truly shocking disparities because of that local discretion.
Oh, the numbers are wild.
Let's look at the first major trigger, the 72-hour law enforcement emergency hold.
Right.
This is when an officer decides a child is in imminent danger and removes them from the home for 3 days while things are investigated.
A huge deal.
Yeah. And the data shows that in Beltrami County, less than 1% of those emergency holds resulted in no further out-of-home placement.
Meaning if they took your kid, they almost always found a reason to keep him in the system.
Exactly. But in Washington County. That number jumps to 38%.
It's staggering. Your zip code effectively dictates your experience with the state.
It really does.
Because a 38% rate of no further placement means that in over a third of cases in that county, a child was subjected to the trauma of a sudden 72-hour removal, only for the state to ultimately decide it wasn't even necessary to keep them in care.
Just ripping a family apart for 3 days and then saying, oops, never mind.
Right. The standard for removing a child in one county is completely different in another, which injects a massive level of geographical chaos into the system right from the start.
Which brings us to the highly subjective nature of how these investigations are triggered, like in Christina's video.
Yeah, her story is a perfect example of this.
She claims the inciting incident that shattered her quiet life with her 7-year-old son, Josiah, wasn't some massive, undeniable crisis. It was a petty neighbor dispute.
Right.
She suspects her apartment manager took a personal dislike to her, and that friction led to escalating complaints. And the wildest one was literally about groceries.
Groceries.
Yeah. The manager allegedly saw Christina's older sons bringing groceries home and reported it to authorities as severe neglect, claiming Christina wasn't feeding her youngest child.
And we see this frequently in administrative systems.
Yeah.
It is a known phenomenon where the context of an action, in this case, older kids helping out with household chores, is entirely rewritten by the observer's bias.
Wow.
It gets stripped of its actual meaning and fed into a bureaucratic machine as a data point of neglect.
But wait, I'm confused here because Christina says the police actually responded to that grocery complaint.
Yeah.
They visited her apartment, they stood in her kitchen, they saw a happy kid, they saw food in the fridge, and they left.
Right.
If the cops literally investigate a claim on the spot, see that everything is perfectly fine, and close the call, shouldn't that be the end of the story? Like, why is a closed police call turn into an open, snowballing CPS case?
Well, if we look at how bureaucracies function at a macro level, it all comes down to risk aversion. An immediate police resolution on the scene doesn't automatically close a Child Protective Services file. The system over-indexes on caution because the societal cost of a false negative is catastrophic.
Oh, I see.
Right?
Yeah.
If an agency closes a file and leaves a child in a home where they are subsequently harmed or killed, it is front-page news. Careers end, agencies are audited.
The blowback would be massive.
Exactly. So, to protect itself, the system keeps the file open and the administrative investigation begins, operating on its own internal logic, entirely separate from the police officer's on-the-ground assessment.
And that internal logic creates an incredible paradox, especially around the concept of mandatory reporting.
Yes, the mandatory reporting aspect is huge here.
Because the neighbor might have opened the file with a baseless complaint, but Christina admits she had a moment of vulnerability that escalated everything.
Right, she's very transparent about that.
She is. In her video, she's very open about being in recovery for addiction. She had a brief relapse, regretted it immediately, and did what society constantly tells people to do. She asked for help.
Which is what we want people to do.
Exactly. She confessed it to her therapist. But her therapist is a mandatory reporter, meaning they are legally required to notify CPS.
And the legal threshold for a professional to make that report is remarkably low. It only requires reasonable suspicion.
That's it.
That's it. It doesn't require hard proof, a drug test, or an independent investigation by the therapist. If they suspect a risk to the child, they must report it. If they don't, they face severe professional and legal penalties themselves.
So the very act of seeking help from a medical professional arms the state with the exact ammunition they need to intervene in your life.
It's a tragic irony, yeah.
The agency took that single data point, the word relapse, and just ran with it. They completely ignored the mitigating context that she was actively in recovery, that she was remorseful, and that she was voluntarily taking parenting classes.
Because massive systems fundamentally struggle to process human nuance. A word like relapse ticks a neat, predefined box on a risk assessment form. Subjective concepts like immediate regret or active recovery or seeking help, they don't fit into those binary boxes. The system sees the risk, not the resilience.
And once that box is ticked, the snowball reaches the bottom of the hill and launches a formal 45-day family investigation.
And that investigation period is intense.
Yeah, A major part of that inevitably involves drug testing, and the testing protocols we found in our sources are a literal maze.
Oh, totally.
We looked at a Reddit forum specifically for social workers and foster parents, and there was a fascinating thread from a mentor asking about a young mother who had just refused a urine test.
Right, and the context of that refusal is really important.
Yeah, because the mother in that scenario claimed she refused the test because the agency wanted her to provide the sample in the direct presence of a male officer.
And given her past traumas, she was extremely uncomfortable with that dynamic, which is completely understandable.
But the consensus from the verified social workers on the Reddit thread was brutal.
Oh, it was unyielding.
They simply stated that any refusal, for any reason whatsoever, is treated by the system as a presumed positive, a dirty test.
Boom. Done.
Yeah. And if she gets placed on what they call a family maintenance plan, which is the scenario where the kids get to stay at home while the parent completes a typical 12 to 18-month case plan, she is mandated to maintain strict sobriety.
I mean, strict.
One former worker even noted that even though marijuana is now fully legal in Minnesota, CPS often expects total unblemished sobriety for the entirety of that case plan.
And that rigid zero-tolerance requirement often leads to agencies utilizing more extreme testing methods to ensure compliance. Which brings us to the law firm blog's breakdown of hair follicle testing.
Oh man, the hair follicle tests.
Yeah, this is one of the most highly controversial tools currently used in family court.
The famous Britney Spears test. The blog actually mentioned that California tightened their rules after she famously shaved her head in 2007 to avoid a hair test during her highly publicized custody battle.
Right. California recognized the inherent flaws and now has specific safeguards, limiting testing to urine specimens that conform to strict U.S. Department of Health and Human Services standards.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Minnesota has no statutory standards for this in their family law legislation.
Wait, none?
None. The statutes are completely silent on what types of chemical tests are admissible, how they should be administered, or what scientific standards they must meet.
Which means Minnesota parents are subjected to a test that the blog points out is incredibly flawed. First of all, it's expensive.
Very.
We're talking upwards of $350 out of pocket, which financially drains parents who are already paying for lawyers just to keep their kids.
And that's if you can even afford the lawyer.
Right. And second, the timeline is wild. It usually screens for a 90-day window, but it can detect traces of substances up to a year back.
Yeah, a full year.
It's like having a faulty smoke detector that goes off today because you burned toast a year ago.
That's a great analogy.
And the state is so terrified of a fire that they just kick you out of the house anyway rather than checking the toaster.
That analogy perfectly highlights the core issue with detection sensitivity here. The thresholds for hair follicle testing are significantly lower than urine testing, meaning even microscopic traces can trigger a positive result.
Wow.
It is notoriously prone to false positives from over-the-counter prescription meds, certain diet pills, or even passive exposure. Literally just being in the same room as someone smoking can bind to the hair.
And the most alarming part of this test, the physical bias.
Yes, this is a huge issue.
The law blog explicitly states that dark, coarse hair is structurally more susceptible to absorbing environmental contaminants. So individuals with darker hair are disproportionately vulnerable to false positives.
Which has massive racial implications.
Right. How can courts legally rely on a test that is scientifically biased and that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services won't even endorse for screening its own federal employees?
It happens because of a massive delegation of power. In Minnesota, the authority to mandate this chemical testing is often delegated down to non-judicial figures like guardians ad litem or custody evaluators.
Okay.
And because there are no strict statutory guidelines constraining them, these individuals can operate with immense discretion. They can demand intrusive, expensive tests based on little more than unsupported allegations.
Jeez.
And a positive result, even a false positive caused by a diet pill, can lead directly to suspended parenting time or mandated supervised visits.
It is a testing trap. And if you get caught in it, you end up in family court facing what's called a CPS petition child in need of protection or services.
Right, the CPS petition.
Stepping into family court is like stepping into a parallel universe where the rules of reality and justice are entirely inverted.
It is a vastly different legal arena than what the general public understands. I mean, when most of us think of court, we think of criminal court, where the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right, the 99% sure rule.
Exactly. That requires roughly a 99% certainty of guilt before the state can take away your freedom.
But according to the YouTube video and confirmed by legal standards, family court operates on a preponderance of the evidence standard, which means just 51% certainty.
51%.
If a judge is 51% sure you're an unfit parent, that is enough to alter custody and remove your child.
Just slightly more likely than not.
Why is the bar so low? I mean, 51% seems like a terrifyingly small margin of error when the state is deciding whether to take away your child.
Well, it comes down to a philosophical balancing act in the law.
Okay, how so?
In criminal court, the philosophy is that it is better for 10 guilty people to go free than for one innocent person to be imprisoned.
Sure, we all know that one.
But family court is balancing the rights of the parent against the immediate physical safety of a child. If they required a 99% certainty of abuse before intervening, the state would essentially be forced to leave children in highly dangerous, potentially lethal situations simply because the abuse occurred behind closed doors and couldn't be definitively proven.
Oh, I see. So they lower the threshold to 51% to prioritize the child's safety.
Exactly. But the unavoidable consequence of that lower bar is that it becomes frighteningly easy for innocent parents to be swept up in the system.
And that low bar leads to Kafkaesque nightmare scenarios. Christina claims she was accused of failing multiple drug tests for methamphetamine, a drug she vehemently denies ever using in her life.
Right.
She begged the agency to physically show her the test results, but she says they met her with silence and vague administrative excuses. She even offered to pay out of pocket for an independent lab test to prove her innocence, and the agency refused to accept it.
And that's telling. A refusal to accept independent scientific verification suggests a bureaucracy that has shifted away from an objective search for the truth and into a defensive posture.
And to just dig their heels in.
Yeah, it becomes about maintaining the narrative it has already constructed in its official files.
She was fighting phantom evidence, and her public defender couldn't help because, as she claimed, the lawyer was completely drowning in an impossible caseload.
Which is sadly very common.
They told her point blank that parents almost never win against the system. The burden of proof essentially shifts to the parent. You have to prove you are perfect while fighting invisible paperwork.
And that invisibility is actually baked into the system's design.
What do you mean?
When we looked at the OLA presentation, they investigated the documentation provided to families. They found that the out-of-home placement plans handed to parents are so lengthy, so laden with legal jargon, and incredibly complex that parents often don't even understand what is required of them to pursue reunification with their own children.
Are you kidding me?
No, it's all in the OLA audit.
Yeah.
Imagine having your child removed, and the roadmap to getting them back is a 30-page document you can't even decipher.
But the confusing paperwork wasn't even the most insidious part of Christina's courtroom battle. She claims the state actively pathologized her faith.
This part of her story is really striking.
It really is. She's a devout Christian, and during incredibly stressful meetings, she would use common idioms like saying she felt she was facing spiritual warfare or that she was relying on God to get her through it.
Very common phrases.
Very common. But the caseworkers took those phrases completely literally.
Right.
They formally labeled her in reports as delusional and paranoid.
Yeah.
But aren't caseworkers in courts trained to look at context? Like if someone is using very common religious phrases, shouldn't an investigator recognize that as a cultural expression rather than a clinical red flag for mental illness?
Well, you would certainly hope so, but this exposes a severe lack of cultural competence within large secular bureaucracies.
Right.
When you have standardized clinical metrics meeting diverse cultural or religious vernaculars without any sort of thoughtful translation, the results are disastrous.
I can imagine.
To a community member, spiritual warfare is a completely normal metaphor for a difficult life struggle. But to an outsider with a clipboard, who is actively scanning for signs of instability to justify a 51% standard of proof.
It sounds like a literal hallucination.
Exactly. Ordinary expressions of distress, or in this case, faith, are easily weaponized by the state as documented mental instability.
So what happens to the families who can't overcome that 51% threshold? The families who fail the flawed hair tests, who get pathologized for their faith? State law explicitly says that the primary goal of child welfare is preserving family ties whenever possible.
The stated goal is indeed reunification. Under state and federal law, agencies are mandated to make reasonable efforts to prevent removal and reunite families.
Reasonable efforts.
Right. However, The OLA findings reveal a massive systemic loophole. Minnesota statutes do not clearly define what reasonable efforts actually look like in practice.
The OLA actually noted that courts accept wildly different levels of activity as reasonable. A caseworker might just hand a parent a pamphlet for a parenting class, and a judge will sign off on that as a reasonable effort to save the family.
Often without even explaining in the court record what efforts were supposedly made.
That's crazy.
And it is vital to contrast this vague, reasonable effort standard with the much stricter active efforts standard.
What's the difference there?
Active efforts is a highly defined legal requirement that must be met before removing American Indian children, established specifically due to historical injustices and forced separations.
Okay.
The difference in those legal standards dictates the actual amount of labor the state has to do. Reasonable efforts can mean merely offering a service. Active efforts means actively helping the family access and succeed in that service.
And if a child is removed because reasonable efforts failed, where do they end up?
The OLA data shows a significant shift in recent years.
Yeah, out-of-home placements are increasingly leaning toward relatives rather than strangers in foster care. It went from 44% in 2014 to 58% in 2019.
Which is a positive trend.
Yeah, and the largest increases in those relative placements were for African American and Hispanic children.
That shift aligns with federal laws requiring agencies to attempt to place children with biological family members first, preserving some sense of cultural and familial continuity.
Right.
And as we saw in the Reddit thread from the social workers, the ideal modern outcome, if intervention is deemed absolutely necessary, is family maintenance.
Right, which we talked about earlier.
Yes, meaning keeping the kids at home while providing support and rigorous monitoring, because social workers recognize that even a temporary removal is a deeply traumatic, life-altering event for a child.
But here is the kicker, and this comes straight from the OLA's evaluation of the court system.
Oh, the performance metrics.
Yes. When we look at how the judicial branch actually measures its own performance in these life-or-death child protection cases, the OLA found that the performance metrics focus almost exclusively on time deadlines.
Just how fast a case moves through the docket.
Right. If the only way we measure a court's success is by how fast they close a case, aren't we incentivizing rushed, potentially disastrous decisions over the actual healing of a family?
You've identified the fundamental flaw of bureaucratic evaluation right there. When a massive system measures speed instead of quality, the nuanced, complex, and incredibly time-consuming work of true family rehabilitation gets pushed aside for administrative efficiency.
It's all about the numbers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You get a system that prioritizes closing files to meet a metric over repairing human lives.
So synthesizing all of this, we've looked at rigid bureaucratic mandates, we've looked at deeply personal tragedies, and what it really reveals is a system where everyday behaviors can be weaponized.
Absolutely.
Kids carrying groceries, specific cultural backgrounds, and minor neighborhood disputes can be completely misinterpreted by massive risk-averse institutions. And those institutions hold the power to literally redefine your reality in a courtroom.
Because the state possesses the profound authority to define what is normal and what is dangerous.
Right.
And as we've explored today, the tools they use to make those definitions, from the 51% burden of proof to the flawed hair follicle tests, are highly susceptible to error, bias, and a lack of cultural context.
You know, if you think the current diagnostic tools are murky, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought that was brought up at the very end of Christina's YouTube video.
AI component.
Yes. The future of this system is predictive AI. Across the country, child welfare agencies are starting to experiment with algorithms that scrape massive amounts of data to automatically generate a numerical risk score for your family.
It's dystopian. Just imagine an algorithm scraping your missed medical appointments, your grocery shopping habits, your financial records, and yes, that petty police call from a neighbor.
And then a computer deciding you are statistically likely to be a danger to your children.
Without ever meeting you.
If human caseworkers already struggle to understand cultural context and nuance, what happens when a faceless algorithm decides your fate? We started this deep dive talking about X-rays and how we crave a clean, visible diagnosis.
Right.
But when you apply the cold binary logic of a machine to the messy, complicated reality of human families, you don't get a clearer picture. The diagnostic muddy waters don't recede, they just get digitized.
A chilling thought indeed.
Something for all of us to mull over. Until next time.